Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law. We're very happy to have all of you join with us for an important conversation on an urgent issue, the mounting, growing, and dangerous attack on voting and voting rights that we see in the halls of Congress and in the Oval Office, and what can be done about it. As many of you know, the Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to strengthen, to reform, and when necessary, to defend the systems of democracy and justice so they work for everybody in this country. Our system of elections, our system of voting, of course, is at the heart of what it means to have a constitutional democracy. It, of course, has come under growing pressure in recent years, and now is the subject of legislation, executive orders, and other legal challenges to the very institutions and infrastructure for our democracy. We're going to look at this in great detail. Before we turn to our expert panel of my colleagues at the Brennan Center, I want to mention a few things. First of all, the Brennan Center is emphatically nonpartisan. We do not support or oppose candidates or parties. We work energetically and vigilantly for democracy and make the arguments we care about in vigorously debating public issues. That's what we are doing today. We care greatly in general and in particular in this event about civility. If there are rude or intemperate remarks in the chat on YouTube, you will be removed from the chat. That is content moderation at its finest. We provide closed captioning, and you can follow along with this conversation with the hashtag on social media, with the hashtag Brennan Center Live. We're having this conversation right now for a few reasons. Late last week, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that purported to take control of the election system in the United States by executive fiat. We're going to discuss whether a president can do that. It gave orders to an independent federal government agency and imposed requirements for registering to vote that have never been required before nationwide and that we believe are illegal. And it comes, and it does other things as well. It comes as Congress has begun to consider in earnest legislation that does a lot of the same things. That bill is called the SAVE Act. Last night, the House Rules Committee voted a rule to send that bill to the House floor this week with no amendments allowed. And we'll hear what that bill would do. We had thought that there might even be a vote on that bill during this conversation. And we had all kinds of plans for dramatic entrance with papers flying and breaking news, but the vote got postponed because the rule in which governed that bill and a number of others went down for unrelated reasons in the House of Representatives. Very typically, when a rule goes down in the House of Representatives, that's actually a big deal. It means that the leadership has lost control of the House of Representatives. In this case, I don't think it means that. We expect this bill to come up. We had thought it was going to come up on Thursday of this week, but we expect it to come up, if not then, any day. All of this, a variety of actions that will affect how people vote. And it's not only in the halls of Congress, it's not only something that is unfolding in the Oval Office, it's also in the courtrooms of our country. Early this morning, as you will hear, at about 3:20 this morning, in fact, the Brennan Center, the ACLU, and other organizations, the NAACP, filed suit against that executive order. We'll hear all about it on behalf of the League of Women Voters and others. The voting rights groups have stepped in energetically. So there's a lot to discuss. What does this mean? How real is this executive order? Will the SAVE Act pass? What are the greatest risks? What can be done about it? And what can all of you do? Much to discuss. I want to introduce you to our expert panel. They're all some of the top voting experts in the country and the top voting experts at the Brennan Center for Justice. And first, to give us the basics about the executive order, which was last week, is Sean Morales Doyle. He is the director of voting rights at the Brennan Center and also deeply involved in every aspect of this. Sean, tell us about the executive order. First of all, what is an executive order, and why do we think this one in particular doesn't have legal authority?
Sure. So an executive order is an order by the president carrying out the president's duty to execute the laws that are passed by Congress. The president doesn't get to make his own laws and set his own agenda. He executes the laws that are put into effect by Congress. In this case, the president is attempting to usurp Congress's role and actually set the rules for federal elections himself, which he doesn't have the authority to do. In this case, the president actually tried to do through an executive order what Congress is considering, as you said, in the passage of the SAVE Act. Congress has been debating and considering the possibility, the very grave possibility of imposing a requirement on American citizens that they show a birth certificate or passport or other citizenship documentation in order to get registered to vote. That so far has not happened in Congress, and so the president has tried to do something very similar through his executive order. He's done that by ordering the Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, an independent bipartisan agency, to change the federal registration form to require a passport or other documents along with registration. The president doesn't get to tell the EAC what to do. They are, again, an independent bipartisan agency that Congress created with the intent of making them independent from presidential control. And he doesn't get to set the rules for elections. Congress can do that because of a provision in the Constitution that gives them the authority to set the times, places, and manner of elections. That provision does not give the president that authority. So we think this is an executive order that has been issued without authority, and that violates the separation of powers that is contemplated by our Constitution, that mixes up the checks and balances that are set by the Constitution. But beyond that, even if he could order the EAC to do things, the laws that Congress has passed actually prohibit the EAC from doing this very thing. Congress passed in 1993 the National Voter Registration Act. People know it as the Motor Voter Law, and it does not allow the EAC to require these kinds of burdensome documentation requirements to make people show up with a passport in order to register to vote. That's just one piece of this executive order. There are other bad things that I know Larry's going to talk about later. But beyond this requirement that people show a passport to register to vote, the order also tries to make the EAC withhold federal funds from states that accept ballots that are mailed in before Election Day but arrive after Election Day. Again, states get to make those decisions. Congress could make that decision, but the president does not. So there are many other things that we'll talk about more, but the basic takeaway is the president doesn't get to do these things.
So I want to unpack very quickly just to make sure folks understand a few of these things. First of all, as you said, presidents cannot seize control of the complex national election system by executive order. And we've all seen this flurry of executive orders in the last 2 months. Many of them have been effectively malevolent press releases rather than actual governmental action. Some of them have been more. And the reason that they have been blocked by so many courts is not that the courts are engaged in a spree of judicial activism, but that the White House is putting forward a lot of actions that lack a basis in law. So one thing to understand is there's a very basic constitutional issue here. The EAC is not an agency probably most people on this call have ever heard of, but Congress set it up, and it's, among other things, it's independent, and it has to have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and they need a majority vote to do things. So it really was set up by law to not be under the thumb of whoever the president is. These are some of the kinds of things, as you can imagine, that we're talking about in the lawsuit. And after Larry goes through some of the other things, we'll come back to talk about the lawsuit. One other question that I have is, what's wrong with having to show a passport? I've got a passport. I bet you've got a passport. Why isn't that an appropriate thing for people to show to prove that they're citizens eligible to vote?
Well, I do have a passport, but mine's actually due for renewal. And anyone that's been through even that process knows that This is not simple or cheap. But more importantly, half of Americans don't have a passport. Only half of us that are eligible citizens, adult American citizens, have passports. And worse than the SAVE Act in this way, the executive order actually doesn't make clear that a birth certificate is proof of citizenship. And that actually is maybe not a big surprise, given that this same president has said that there's no more birthright citizenship in a separate executive order. And so if there's no birthright citizenship, then a birth certificate actually doesn't prove that you're a citizen. So by limiting this to passport and a couple other documents that frankly barely exist, the president is potentially saying that really everybody just needs a passport to register to vote. And that immediately cuts half of the American citizen population out of our electorate, which is really, really concerning.
Thank you, Sean. So Larry Norden. Larry, as many of you know, is Senior Director of our Elections and Government Program and is one of the country's leading experts on election administration. The widespread disenfranchisement that we think would come from some of these provisions in this executive order, were it to ever take effect, have gotten most of the attention. But there's some other elements in this that really make the power grab pretty explicit. I want to ask you about one thing to start with. Perhaps you might have heard of a fellow named Elon Musk. The executive order actually gives an order to states and says that the federal government will cut off money unless they let Elon Musk's Doge have access to the voter rolls and the voter records of the states. So my question to you is, what's so wrong about that? What could go wrong?
Yeah, well, quite a few things. I'll focus on two. And again, I think we should emphasize, Michael, as you did, that this executive order in particular is mostly a malevolent press release. So what actually happens, we'll see. But the voter rolls contain a lot of very personal data. And to the extent that Elon Musk and Doge are going to be asking for data on people's like social security numbers, which are on the voter rolls, the driver's license numbers, their dates of birth. I think a lot of people probably wouldn't be comfortable with Doge having access to that data for every American and to do who knows what with. There is some precedent for this in President Trump's first term. As you'll remember, Michael, there was something called the Pence-Kobach Commission, and they actually also asked the states for this information, and there was huge bipartisan pushback because there are state laws and federal laws that say this information is protected. And you actually had several Republican secretaries of state saying, no way are you going to get this information. We'll see how the states react this time around. But we've already seen some secretaries of state, Secretary Fontes of Arizona just last week, or actually it was over the weekend, used some very colorful language in saying there was no way he was going to let Doge have access to that state database and their information. There's a broader concern here, even if they don't get access to some of this very personal data, and that is that electioneers in the past have tried to use voter data to make a lot of faulty claims about fraud, and I think as folks know, both Doge and Elon Musk, neither of them actually have particularly good records when it comes to making claims about fraud. They've had to walk back a number of claims that they've made. And so there's an additional danger here when we're talking about this kind of malevolent press release, that this is just used to further the false narratives about non-citizen voting, which is, it's very easy to imagine unverified claims of non-citizen registration and voting coming out of this.
And you pointed out another thing that's in this executive order, which, is over the head of most of us, but it has to do with voting machines. Mm-hmm. And it suggests that, among other things, the order is sloppily drafted and doesn't necessarily fully know all the implications of its own words. It talks about certification of election machines. And in fact, we've gotten a lot of questions from all of you before who are watching before this conversation, one of the questions is, what is certification of a voting machine and why does it matter? What does the executive order, again, purport to do? None of this stuff we believe has the force of law, but what does it seem to be doing?
Yeah, well, it explicitly orders the EAC to decertify every voting system that is in use in the United States. There's a federal certification process. It's voluntary, but and I can get to that in a second. It purports to decertify all the voting machines that are in use. It says a new standard will be created, and you can and vendors can reapply to get their system certified. The problem is that new standard, there is no system currently that could satisfy that standard. So you potentially have not a single federally certified system in the United States going into the 2026 election. Now, certification is quote unquote voluntary under federal law, but a number of states have a requirement in state law that says that their voting machines have to be federally certified to use. Some really big states, Texas, Georgia, Ohio, North Carolina, say their systems have to be federally certified. So right now, going into the 2026 election, there wouldn't be any system that they could use that would satisfy those legal requirements. And even if you can imagine some world where new standards could get set up very quickly, I submit it would be impossible in time for the 2026 election to get those systems retested. We know how long this takes. It generally takes a couple of years to get those systems retested, manufactured, put in service so that they could be used in time for the 2026 election. There's a more general problem, though, and it is just a problem of this executive order. It's an amplification of a lot of conspiracy theories, whether it's about the voting machines that have been hacked or by non-citizen voting. This is all meant, I submit, to amplify those conspiracy theories. And my concern is this pushes what a lot of the conspiracy theorists have wanted, which is to move to hand counting of all the ballots, which would mean it would take probably weeks or months in the 2026 election to get results. And I'm afraid it's going to push, even for states that don't require certification, an effort to replace their equipment ahead of a 2026 election or to get rid of it altogether.
And it's important to remember, because you sometimes hear, President Trump say he demands that there be paper ballots everywhere. In fact, that's right. And the good news is there are paper ballots almost everywhere, certainly in all the swing states in 2024.
That's a really good point, Michael. I wanted to make sure to get that in. We have much more secure systems than we did even a few years ago because we have moved to paper ballots around the country, and 99% of Americans voted on paper ballots in 2024 are accurate. That is really a critical piece of information.
Paper ballots are how you can do audits after the fact. It's how you can do recounts. It's how we know the 2020 election was not stolen. But counting them by hand is a nightmare. The best system, which is the one we have, is paper ballots counted by machine and subject to recounting. A lot of this nonsense in this executive order, which would be extraordinarily dangerous if it were to come to pass and have the force of law, is also echoing this legislation that is now before Congress. And again, we thought we were going to have exciting, dramatic votes during this call, but it'll happen within days in the House of Representatives, of the legislation known as the SAVE Act. And Wendy Weiser, you are helping lead the national fight against this bill, and what does the SAVE Act say about what kind of documents you need to produce to register to vote in the United States? And remember, this would have the force of law. It couldn't be undone by some later president writing a new executive order.
Yeah, the SAVE Act is a vote suppression bill that is currently pending before Congress. And like the executive order, it would purport to require a passport, unlike the executive order, or a birth certificate, or a few other documents to register or re-register to vote in American elections. Like the executive order, it would actually have a staggering disenfranchising impact on Americans. We know that 21.3 million Americans don't have a passport, birth certificate, or naturalization papers readily available and could be denied the ability to register and vote upon passage of this law. But that's not all that this bill does. I wanted to say this doesn't only impact people who are registering to vote for the first time. Anybody who moves or needs to re-register will have to follow the same show me your papers requirements. And it's not going to be easy to do it. Everybody who wants, under the SAVE Act, you actually have to go show these papers in person to an election official, meaning that the SAVE Act would also completely upend many of the most popular forms of voter registration in the United States. So in addition to keeping out huge millions and millions of eligible citizens, it would also end mail registration, online registration, registration using voter registration drives, and would also severely curtail automatic voter registration. So it's a pretty sweeping vote suppression bill that is currently pending before Congress, and we got to stop it.
And, as we've said, this is probably not the worst voting bill anybody ever dreamed up. But if it were to become law, it would be the worst voting bill ever passed by the Congress of the United States. One of the questions, Wendy, that we've gotten from folks joining us, and this is, as you know, something that has really gotten a lot of attention, is the particular impact, even beyond that 21 million figure that Brennan Center Research produced, the particular harmful impact on women and married women. Could you explain what that is all about, and how real a worry is that?
It's absolutely a serious worry. We know that 21 million people don't have these documents. Many, many more people don't have those documents with their current legal names on it. And married women in particular, we know that 79% of us have changed our names so that our names do not match the names on our birth certificates, which means those people can be immediately blocked and kept from registering to vote under the SAVE Act if it becomes law. I will add that the people that don't have these documents, and we've studied this, these are based on studies that the Brennan Center has done with some other partners, such as at the University of Maryland. We know that these are not hypothetical voters. The people that don't have these documents are actually largely currently registered to vote and have voted in recent elections. So this would immediately change the electorate, and in particular, women who are currently registered to vote or might want to re-register to vote. A huge number of us are going to be completely thwarted by this legislation if it became law.
And, as you know, this issue, this aspect of the SAVE Act has gone viral. There's a lot of concern about it, a lot of understanding about this element of it. And it's many tens of millions of people whose maiden name and married name are different, and could find themselves affected by this in unexpected ways. The legislation, as I said, was going to be coming to a vote this week. What is the prospect for the bill in the House, and what is the prospect for the bill in the Senate?
So we can still beat back this legislation. We expected the bill to go to a vote this week on the floor of the House of Representatives. It will come up soon. That's been scuttled by these other developments. We expect that it will pass the House of Representatives on a largely party line vote. But at the Senate, it needs to get 60 votes to become law. And we think that that's still it might have a hard time achieving that. This is something that we can beat back if we make sure that our representatives know we don't want this vote suppression bill. This is going to be harmful to our elections, and it's going to disenfranchise millions and millions of eligible American citizens. It is not an immigration bill. It is not an election integrity bill. It is a vote suppression bill. And if we keep at it, we can actually stop this from passing in the Senate.
So in other words, to emphasize that point, under the current rules, I think whatever one thinks about those rules, you need 60 votes to bring a bill like this to a final vote. And there's a strong chance that there will not be 60 votes, but I think it's important that people understand the stakes and that people make their voices heard. I have a broader question, and then I want to turn to some of the questions, especially about the executive order that folks have asked. Why isn't it okay to ask people to prove their citizenship? It's a pretty important thing when they register or when they vote. Isn't it the case, as some people worry, that non-citizens could be on the rolls and that we don't have adequate protections against that? And I guess, Sean, I'll ask you that question because I know you're grappling with that in a bunch of different contexts.
The short answer is that states already have multiple systems in place to ensure that only eligible citizens are voting in our elections. This additional burden, imposition, requirement that people cannot meet is not necessary to protect our elections because we already have a bunch of protections in place. For one thing, under federal law, every single person who is registering to vote in federal elections is currently swearing under penalty of perjury that they are a U.S. citizen. It is a crime under every state's law to register or to vote while ineligible. It is a crime under federal law to register or to vote in federal elections while ineligible. So those safeguards, in addition to safeguards on the back end, that is voter list maintenance that states conduct to review their rolls and ensure that only eligible voters are on the rolls, work that the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services do to hold people accountable if they ever were to violate these laws. All those things working together actually have us in a place where only eligible citizens are voting, except for in vanishingly rare cases. And in those vanishingly rare cases, it is usually a non-citizen who misunderstood or was misled about their eligibility. We just don't have a problem that we need to fix here. We've already got all the safeguards in place. And imposing a requirement that would disenfranchise tens of millions of Americans cannot possibly be the solution to that problem that does not exist. You're muted, Michael.
Whoops.
You're not now. You're good.
5 years in, I should know how to do this by now. And it's important to note that you'll hear in the debates over the SAVE Act, for example, people conflate this with, oh, what's wrong with voter ID? This is not showing a driver's license or some other kind of ID that many people have. This is a far more restrictive set of papers that need to be produced than is the case in just about any state.
And in fact, the SAVE Act and the executive order attempt to mislead American voters about that point, I think. Both of them suggest that a real ID might be sufficient, but actually it's not, because real IDs, for the vast, vast majority of real IDs in this country, do not indicate whether you're a citizen or not. And so there's sort of this red herring thrown out there, both by Congress in the SAVE Act and by the president in his executive order, that a lot of proponents of the SAVE Act have been using to mislead Americans and suggest that this is just some sort of ID requirement, but it is far, far more burdensome than that.
Yeah.
And for those folks who don't know what a real ID is, it's the enhanced driver's license that you get in a lot of states, including New York, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't say whether New York residents, for example, are citizens. The lawsuits are part of a barrage of legal challenges to the executive orders that have been put forward by this White House. This lawsuit by the Brennan Center and the ACLU actually joins two other lawsuits also filed in the last day about this. Wendy, what are the chances in court of these lawsuits? And one of the big questions that are on everybody's mind is, will these end up at the Supreme Court, and will the administration follow them?
Well,
what the rulings are.
As one of the lawyers on these lawsuits, I can say that the lawsuits have a really good chance of success in the courts. We think that these are very strong claims. We think that the president has no authority to set the rules for federal elections. And we think that this clearly also violates what Congress has already established under the motor voter law, as Sean said. There are multiple lawsuits on this. We expect that this order will be blocked. We expect this that this will not actually go into effect. I will give back in 2017, the President Trump tried to establish, it was a task force on election integrity, a so-called task force on election integrity, the Pence-Kobach Commission, that also was trying to sweep up the voter rolls across the country and try to find phantom evidence of a stolen election or widespread voter fraud. That too was shut down in the face of litigation across the country, including lawsuits that we brought and others in states across the country, arguing that the voter rolls that they were trying to sweep up were actually protected by privacy laws. So we think that the last time there was an attempt to meddle in federal elections, that was swiftly rebuffed by the courts, and that commission shuttered in anonymity. We expect the same thing to happen this time around, and we hope that people don't treat the mere fact that the president wrote this strongly worded suggestion in an executive order as an assumption that anything has changed in our election rules so far.
And this is that's an excellent point. And we all need to remember this. If any journalists are here with us, I encourage you to think about this as headlines are written and stories are written. Much of the time, the drama and Sharpie signatures from the Oval Office don't have much power. When I read headlines, President Trump takes over Smithsonian, all it really was is he has one vote in J.D. Vance on the committee, which includes the Chief Justice of the United States and others. And he was basically instructing Vance on how to vote. He's allowed to do that, but it's important that shock and awe depends on all the rest of us being shocked and awed. And it's important that we keep this kind of thing in context. We think this is a strong lawsuit, not surprisingly, since we brought it. One of the questions that a number of folks have had is the question of whether the administration would follow court rulings on this or other things. Now, there may be some specific technicalities with court rulings on this, since the agency that is involved is independent anyway. But why do we think this president would follow court orders on this? When there's been so much noise from his supporters, at the very least, saying, why should we let courts meddle in our work, meddle in the executive branch and its activities? Does one of my colleagues want to take a run at that?
I'll start and pass it to Sean. This executive order actually purports to order other people and entities to do things. It orders the independent bipartisan agency, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, to make changes. The president doesn't have authority over those agencies and those changes, and it would be illegal for them to do so. The president might not want to comply with that order, but I expect that the agency will. It tries to make orders on other federal agencies, such as the Department of Defense, to actually make it harder for military and overseas voters to register to vote, not only requiring citizenship documents, but also proof that they're eligible to vote in the states that they're in. Again, if there's a court order against that, that will go against the Department of Defense. So I think that one reason that people can be comforted is that the agency, is that those who the order is going to run against are not just the president. The president has not yet, it remains to be seen. There are tools that courts have to actually encourage and even press for enforcement of their orders, but there are third parties that are between the president and any attempted regulation of federal elections.
What I would add to that, thank you, Wendy. What I would add to that, and this is a broader topic that, as you can imagine, we, along with many others, are wrestling with. There've been a variety of court orders, especially in trial courts. When they've happened, J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, and other allies of the administration have put out statements like, oh, these judges are just meddling in the workings of the executive branch. The Constitution gives the president exclusive control over anything that happens within the executive branch without the rule of law applying in effect. And it's been quite worrisome and alarming. But then the administration's lawyers walk into court and say quietly, oh, we will follow the court orders. Of course we will. And Donald Trump himself, President Trump himself, has said a few times, of course we follow court orders. We always do. So it may well be that there's still a lot of smoke and noise here, but that the normal processes of the judiciary and the executive branch will be followed. I think it's certainly very important that sooner or later we say everybody, including presidents, have to follow court orders and the rule of law. And that is entirely beyond the question, as Wendy says, of the specific nature of this executive order is it actually doesn't really do things out of the White House. It tries to get an independent agency to do things. Now, in a variety of these other cases that the Brennan Center is involved with and helping with amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs, and other aspects of the great constitutional debates that are underway, this president is claiming the ability to fire commissioners of independent agencies that are set up by Congress to be beyond the reach of the presidency. And there will be cases around that and the ability of presidents to do that, although they haven't been joined yet on this EAC matter. And in a way, our lawsuit is part of that debate. A question for Larry Norton from the audience. What can states do? Can states who are under pressure from the White House here just refuse to comply? What if a state doesn't want to hand over its records to the Doge boys or the federal government?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned earlier, Adrian Fontes, the Secretary of State of Arizona, was interviewed over the weekend, and when asked if he would turn over records if Doge came by, what his response would be. And he said, hell no. And I do think that, at the end of the day, the Constitution is very clear. Sean mentioned Congress, but it's states under the Constitution that run our elections unless Congress passes a law about federal elections as to time, place, or manner. So no question that the states at the end of the day are in charge of their elections. And if they're asked for information that they don't want to provide or that they're not allowed to provide under state law, that they can and should push back. And I expect to see many of them will, as Wendy said, they did in 2017 when the Trump administration, through the Pence-Kobach Commission, attempted to do this before in trying to seek that kind of information.
And of course, in 2017, you had even Republican as well as Democratic secretaries of state competing to say how indignant they were about the invasion of privacy involved in the federal government reaching into the states. The Mississippi Secretary of State, if I remember correctly, said that they could jump in the Gulf of Mexico, as it was and is called now. And you had a lot of other sort of home state secretaries of state competing with how they could describe how to tell the federal government to go away. And
remember, they're bound by state law too, not just federal law, right? And so, to the extent that there are obligations for them under state law to protect the privacy of their voters, that's going to be really important too.
And in other words, state officials have a duty to not obey in advance. Yeah. In this instance, as in others, and that is a phrase that we're all familiar with in thinking about how to address governmental and executive overreach, but it's actually suggested by one of the audience members. A broader question. This is all, of course, coming in the context of the 2026 election, which shockingly is a year and a half away. We have a lot of elections in this country, and they come very quickly. And of course, elections are how voters have their voice heard. They're how power is held to account. Midterm elections often create an opportunity for course corrections and other things. How worried should we be about the security of the 2026 election? We all know that despite all the pressure that our election systems were under in 2024, the system held. There were many unfairnesses in how our elections are run, but in terms of security, in terms of accuracy, in terms of, by and large, freedom from violence and disruption, the election was successfully administered. But things have changed to some extent, including the laws and executive orders we're discussing. What's different about 2026? How concerned should we be? And what are the areas of strength?
So if I can start, I will.
Yeah, please do. And I know everyone's got some thoughts on that.
So first of all, I think when you talk about strengths, the strength in our system is that elections are run at the state and local level. The danger right now, I would say, is the federal government has really pulled back from election security. I'm not sure how aware people are, but the main agency that partnered with states to provide security, cybersecurity, physical security, it's called CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. All of their election security work was frozen by the administration. A lot of the key people that assisted around security with states and locals have been fired. So that's a really big gap. And on top of that, you have the FBI task force on foreign influence was shut down. The information sharing networks that the federal government supported was shut down. There's been a big cuts to federal support for elections. So there's a lot to be concerned about there, and a lot of gaps that have to be filled. But as I said when I started out, the good news is, in the area where we have a lot to feel good about, is the states control our elections, and they can start trying to fill those gaps. And we have some advanced time now, because these cuts came so quickly, to try to make them up at the state level.
So I hear you saying one of the big changes, one of the things that was quite noteworthy and significant in 2024 was that law enforcement at the state and local level really stepped up to work with election officials through the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which we helped organize, but in a whole bunch of other ways, to bring that stability and strength, and that the federal government played its role. But what I hear you saying is that the federal cop has been pulled off the beat in terms of cybersecurity and disinformation, and in a way that I don't think, with all the exciting things happening, that's not something folks know a lot about. But Wendy Weiser, there's something beyond that, which is now the federal government potentially could be working to make things much harder at the state level and pointing a weaponized gun at state elections. What are we looking at? What should we be paying attention to? And how can we fight back against that?
So in Project 2025, which turned out not to be something that was a side paper that the president wasn't paying any attention to, there is a very detailed plan to try to weaponize the Department of Justice to go after state and local election officials and groups that mobilize voters, and in particular, officials who tried to facilitate voter access in 2020 or did not go along with any lies that the 2020 election was stolen. That same kind of weaponization, if it gets adopted, can be used to try to pressure officials at the state and local level to take actions that could harm the integrity of the elections and disenfranchise lots and lots of voters. So the Department of Justice and the weaponization of that improperly is something that we are monitoring and intend to fight back vigorously against. That would be improper and unlawful, we believe. And their theories are loopy and we believe incorrect. We're also worried that the Department of Justice actually has an affirmative job to do it is supposed to be protecting voting rights against attacks. It is supposed to be the chief civil rights law enforcement officer protecting us from efforts to undermine our federally protected voting rights. And there's been a real retreat in that regard at the same time as we are seeing those attacks both from government officials, but also from vigilantes and other activists on the rise. And so we're concerned that there are going to be stepped up efforts to try to interfere in the election, to try to make it harder for people to vote, things that we've seen gaining steam in the last couple of elections with much fewer protections and without the umbrella of the federal government to oversee and to try to fight for voters. That is something that we too need to help step in and push back against.
So we've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to stack them up and try to answer them myself, and my colleagues can tell me if I'm getting it wrong, which will give the audience a glimpse of life inside the Brennan Center. One is, could agencies follow through on threats to pull funding from states that don't comply with the executive order? We would say not lawfully, they couldn't. Again, they're prohibited by the laws that they're supposed to implement. And they're certainly under no order from the president that's lawful to do that. And of course, that is what the litigation seeks to forestall. Another question is, if the SAVE Act is enacted, the legislation in Congress, and Congress, again, does have the power to pass national voting legislation, would it preempt state laws that don't require proof of citizenship for voting? The answer to that is yes. That is why it's so important, in our view, not to make the mistake of enacting this law. It would undo the way state elections are run, way voter registration is run. In the few states that have tried varieties of similar requirements for showing citizenship proof and other things, it has already, when it's been tried, disenfranchised many voters, and they've actually pulled back from doing it. But the answer is federal legislation, and we're going to get to this in a second, does apply all across the country. So far, I'm doing okay, right, folks?
Yep.
And final question that I do want to ask is, this is a time when a lot of bad ideas are floating around in terms of voting. But actually, when you look at the last 10, 15, 20 years, nationwide, there have been considerable improvements made in how we run elections. We heard about the voting machines being improved. We heard about security being improved. We know that automatic voter registration, something the Brennan Center helped pioneer, is now the law in close to half the states. And is there federal legislation that we think would be an important thing, a good thing for Congress to consider, instead of misguided legislation, as we see it, like the SAVE Act? This is a big fat pitch for somebody to swing at.
I'm happy to take it. Yes, there is good legislation for Congress to consider. Congress, as you said earlier, Michael, this SAVE Act would be, monumental in that it would be Congress actually suppressing voting. Historically, what Congress has done when it's acted on voting, as it has the power to do under a few different provisions of the Constitution, is expanded access to our democracy, expanded the freedom to vote, protected voting rights against race discrimination and other attempts to suppress the vote. And that's what they should be doing right now. And they should be passing the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which are two pieces of legislation that actually came very close to passing a few years ago in Congress, but didn't quite make it because of a filibuster. One of them, the Freedom to Vote Act, would essentially take all of these improvements you've talked about in the states over the last 15, 20 years, automatic voter registration, same-day registration, and other things, and make that the floor across the country. Because to that earlier viewer's question, if the federal government says it's the rule, then it's the rule across the country in federal elections. And so that would set a floor for the way elections should function nationwide. And then the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore the Voting Rights Act to its full power after it's taken multiple blows from the U.S. Supreme Court, and make sure that we also still have all the protections that we need against states and other actors trying to restrict voting rights, and engage in race discrimination in voting. That's what Congress should be spending its time doing. Instead, it is considering sort of distinguishing itself as the first Congress in our nation's history to go about trying to make it harder to vote.
And Sean and Wendy, along with a number of Brennan Center colleagues, had the privilege of being in Selma, Alabama a few weeks ago to commemorate with so many others the Bloody Sunday March at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Selma to Montgomery March, and the fight that got us the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it's always really important in thinking about national legislation. The issue of voting has often been contentious. It's always been politically charged, but it has usually been bipartisan. It has not been one political party or another political party that has taken a pro or anti-voter stance. And our aspiration, of course, is that we have that kind of bipartisan, civic, nonpartisan approach. The last time the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized by Congress, which was in 2006, it passed the Senate 98 to nothing. That is not 250 years ago. That was very recently in this scheme of things. We all, of course, hope that we can recapture that. I'll note as well that the Freedom to Vote Act, in addition to the voting measures such as automatic voter registration, expanded early and guaranteed access to early voting, also addressed gerrymandering and redistricting reform, and addressed the role of big money in politics. It banned dark money in federal elections, and did other things to address the matter that has only gotten more intense in the months since the last Congress met. One more question from the audience, and then I'm going to turn to my colleagues for some final remarks. One question we get over and over again is, what can we do? What can you do? What can citizens do at a moment like this? Part of the answer is use your own platforms. Use your own ability to share stories of people you know who've been affected by all the policy and legal changes and firings and everything that are going on all around us. The second big thing we would say is, if you feel as we do about the SAVE Act, this is something where Congress is feeling the heat. This is actually becoming an intensely lobbied and an intensely debated issue. So while we don't think this is happening in 2 days or 2 hours, as we thought might be the case, let your members of Congress know, both in the House and in the Senate, if you agree with us that the SAVE Act is a terrible idea and that Congress should reject it. We would say also to pay close attention to the work of organizations like the Brennan Center, subscribe to our newsletters and other things of that nature. And finally, there is a petition, one of many ways. We can all protest. We can be in the streets when appropriate. There are protests all over the country on April 5th on a number of different issues. There's a petition that the organization Democracy Forward has put together for people to sign and amass their voices. And I believe that should be coming up in the chat or available to people if it isn't that way already. Many, many things we can do. The laws of political gravity have not been repealed. These debates are just beginning in so many ways. The final question I want to have for my colleagues is, what is the one thing you want our audience to walk away with from this conversation? And I will start, Larry Norton, with you. And you are on mute.
Sorry about that. I guess the thing I want folks to walk away with is an understanding this executive order. You called it a malevolent press release, Michael. Whether it's the executive order, the SAVE Act, we're going to be fighting those. But at the end of the day, even if they fail, what they really are is an amplification of disproven conspiracy theories. And we've got to push back on that. I think a lot of that work happens in the states, getting the states to step up to push back themselves if DOJ comes to them and asks them to comply. but also to kind of fill the gaps that the federal government has created now to make sure that we have fair, free, secure elections in 2026.
So I want folks to recognize that the fight for free and fair elections in 2026 and 2028 is on now. It is important. That is, the elections are when voters get to have our say, get to change course if we want to change course, get to tell our representatives what we think of what's going on. And they only play that role in a democracy if they are free and fair. And there is going to be, and there already is, mounting an attack on those elections. We need to be vigilant. We need to push back. We can push back, but elections don't stay free and fair without a fight. And the fight, particularly around the SAVE Act, which is hitting the floor, is a winnable one. It is not won. We need to make our voices heard, but we can win and start the momentum of saying we will not let people interfere in or try to meddle in our elections.
Sean.
My mute was taking me a second there. Sorry. I would build on what Wendy and Larry both said with a point that I've actually heard Wendy make many times, which is we do still have a system of checks and balances. There are a few prominent checks that exist on the president, on the executive branch, on the creep towards authoritarianism. There's Congress, and unfortunately right now we are witnessing Congress fail to exercise that role and indeed engage in, the kind of thing we've been talking about today, considering the SAVE Act. There's the courts, and they have been actually playing that role of checking the president repeatedly. He is on this epic losing streak right now for a reason, and we hope that will continue, and that's why we're going to the court on the executive order that we've been discussing today. But we've also seen the president, threaten the defiance of court orders, et cetera. That's for a reason, because that's a check that's working. And another really big check that we have, as Wendy referenced, is elections. We have the ability for the people to exercise their voice and be heard. And that is, we are now also seeing many different actions by this administration and by Congress to disrupt free and fair elections. That includes the SAVE Act, it includes this executive order, but it also includes, sending a message to vigilantes that subverted elections, that this administration will have their back through the January 6th pardons. It includes appointing someone to run the Civil Rights Division that is not going to be enforcing voting rights laws. It includes dismantling CISA, as Larry talked about earlier. This, as Wendy said, this fight is already happening. But I want to remind people that what this fight is about is your ability to have your voice heard. So in addition to all the things that Michael said people can be doing, one that we all need to always have top of mind, and the reason why I do my job and we all do our jobs, is to make sure that you can vote. So please keep that one top of your list, and vote in all of the elections that are coming, including those that are coming up in 2026.
What I hear from everybody is no doomerism. These are fights that can be waged and won, that the right to vote always requires a fight to vote, and that this is when the people have their loudest chance to have their voice heard. We will continue to keep you informed. We will continue to do the rigorous research that we do around these election issues. We will continue when necessary to be in these fights ourselves. Please join us for future events. Please make sure to sign up for our newsletters. Probably most of you are, if you're on this conversation, but you can see them on our website or below. And if you want to be the first to know when the Brennan Center is holding more virtual events like this, be sure to sign up for the events newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. We're building a bigger and bigger community. We have now 400,000 plus subscribers to our newsletters. Many thousands join our events. People care about our democracy, and that's a good place to be. So thank you, everybody. I'm Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to my colleagues.